Hey everybody! Oh fuck! I don't have my notes up. Let me start all over on that. I'm not even going to edit that out. Okay, so this is how I start all my vlogs. Three, two. Hey everybody! This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Hercules. I had two choices for this week. It was Hercules or Lucy. I thought both films looked like they'd probably turn out okay, but Hercules just spoke to me more. I'm a big mark for these big, dumb, epic fantasy films. And plus, I really do like The Rock, so it was a pretty easy decision for me. I'll probably see Lucy when it comes out on DVD first thing. I'll bump it immediately to the top of my Netflix queue. Or maybe I'll even see it in theaters. There's nothing coming out in these next few weeks, although I'm pretty sure every week has a pretty big release like Guardians of the Galaxy and Expendables 3, but Hercules it is for today. And holy shit, I'm actually getting this out on opening day. It seems like lately I've been having to wait like 4 days after I've seen the movie before I could actually sit down and start filming. So, was Hercules any good? It was okay. It's exactly what I figured it would be. It's fantasy fluff. It's very safe. It takes no risks. It delivers everything that you would want out of a movie like this in a competent fashion, but nothing about it ever really excelled either. It's comprised entirely of cliches. In fact, I don't think the writers who actually got credit for this movie really deserved it. They should have probably just listed every single writer who has ever written a fantasy film as the screenwriter for this movie. To be fair, though, I'm not very familiar with the actual Legend of Hercules, and I'm talking about the legend, not the movie Legend of Hercules. I am unfortunately very familiar with that one. So when I was being kind of a smartass while I watched this movie. I'm like, hey, this movie's kind of ripping off that other Hercules movie, but I'm pretty sure that those similar sequences probably occurred in the original story, but I'm also sure the original story inspired many of the cliches that other films would exploit, so by the time they actually got around to making the various Hercules movies, it now seems dated and cliched in comparison. But the characters, their decisions, the story twists, who turns out to be a good guy or who turns out to be a bad guy, it's all very, very frighteningly familiar to where you almost find yourself wondering if you've seen this movie before. And it doesn't even really try to mask any of the cliches either. But so yeah, this film does not have an original bone in its body, and it knows it. The only real creative idea was how they play up the myth aspect of the story. So, it starts off where they're narrating, the famous Hercules moments, like when he slays the Hydra and you see him fighting a Hydra. Well, it turns out that that's all bullshit and an exaggeration of what really happened. And you don't quite get the whole story there, but it's just presumed that a couple of guys dressed up as Hydra, and that's somehow how that myth was born after Hercules killed them. I did like that, but even that's not totally original anymore. I've seen plenty of films, have that same idea within the past 10 years or so. So even that it already seems kind of like it's a cliche in its own way, but at least that provided a little bit of depth. Not much, but a little bit. So yeah, in terms of the screenplay, very conventional, nothing original. But did you really expect anything else? I was kind of hoping they'd go based on what I heard the original story is, where Hercules did kill his wife and family. I don't really remember why, but and so his adventures after that are based on his atonement. Well, we know that that's not really what happened in this movie, even though it's set up as if he maybe did kill them. So you guess where they're going with that long before they actually reach there. But it's in its own way, it's kind of fun. Pointing out, well, okay, that guy's obviously going to turn out to be a villain, and then 30, 40 minutes later, guess who was right? I don't see how anybody could be genuinely shocked at anything that happens in this movie. The action is good. I did not see this in 3D. I don't know if it would work very well. I'm not sure if it's a conversion or not. And I don't usually pay attention to when you have a lot of 3D shots unless I'm actually watching it in 3D. But it seemed like the action was kind of chaotic to really focus on what would be the 3D money shots. Usually, you know, when a film was made to be for 3D, they'll have like a lot of scenes where, you know, you'll have something flying at the camera. It'll also often be in slow motion, but in this film it seemed like the majority of the action, there was a shit ton of stuff happening all around the main characters. It's all very fast paced. You know, pretty exciting, very enjoyable. The film in general is very fast-paced. It's also very short, so even if you don't like the movie because it is very unoriginal and kind of forgettable, yeah, I thought it was mostly a harmless experience, worst case scenario. So I don't know if the 3D is good or not. You'll have to check out somebody else's review to, you know, make your decision there, but it seems like this movie probably would not have made for a very good 3D experience, but I could be wrong. The CGI, and this, make no mistake, this film is CGI porn, and it's pretty obvious when they're using CGI. It's on and off. It had some moments where, yeah, I bought into it. I believed that this location was real, this monster was real. Then other times it looked pretty average. A lot better than what we got from The Legend of Hercules. But you know, it's a standard CGI film. You know, there are times when you're going to say that looks very much like a very effective, polished CGI effect, but it doesn't look like a real wolf. But one thing I did like, though, is that this film is very colorful, in total contrast to The Legend of Hercules, which had like a lot of washed out colors, and that just made the film seem kind of bland, because presumably they were going for a more grounded in reality, bleaker telling of the story. Well, this film, it has a lot of vibrant colors that really stood out, and I thought in a lot of ways that saved the movie when the CGI was failing. So for example, I don't even know why this scene stood out so much, but one of the very first effects you see is these two snakes. They look pretty shoddy, but they're very green, and something about that just made for a nice aesthetic visual. Kind of botched that line. But that's I think what I'm trying to emphasize the most here, is that it is a very pretty film, some genuinely gorgeous cinematography, but even when the special effects failed, they did have their own appeal, just in terms of the color scheme. But I think what I liked about this movie the most is its sense of humor. The cast does really good. They're you know, they're playing very conventional characters. They don't have a whole lot of time to flesh these characters out, but the cast, they have enough screen time dedicated to them to where they can stand out and be larger than life and very fun and charismatic. I enjoyed watching almost all the interactions, except maybe the whole bit with the love story, just because it's a very, well, it's not even really a full-on love story. It's one of those issues where it could bloom into that, but to this film's credit, it never became too sappy there. But it's an implied love story, if anything. And the whole bit with the kid was pretty obnoxious too. That kid was so cheesy. It's just a typical hero worshipping kid who obsesses over Hercules, and it's intended to be sweet, and it kind of is. The Rock, I thought, sold that pretty well, but at the same time I was constantly rolling my eyes whenever that kid would show up on screen. Just a bit too smulchy for my tastes. But when it came to Hercules and his group, they're all a lot of fun to watch. I really liked the guy from Sparta. He just had the best lines, the best reactions to things. At first I was concerned that he was going to be like a Rob Schneider type of character, and if this movie was made in the 90s, that's probably what he would have been, but he in his own way is pretty badass, and he complimented the film very well. In a lot of ways he stole the show for me. Everything that came out of his mouth made me laugh. But The Rock did really good too. It's admittedly not a very challenging role, but he is so charismatic that, yeah, he carries the film fine. And compared to, like, let's say The Scorpion King, where he also showed that he was a very charismatic leading man. In that film, he was such a novice that his line delivery was really kind of off in a lot of parts. Here, though, yeah, even when he's saying some really goofy sounding lines, he delivers them so naturally that it makes them work. So The Rock, he definitely was the right casting choice for to play the role of Hercules. Much better than Kellen Lutz, if anything. But everything about Hercules is better than The Legend of Hercules. As I believe I said in my review of that, the best thing to happen to this movie was The Legend of Hercules, because even if it wasn't very good, even if it was completely mediocre, it would have still looked so much better in comparison to that film. So yeah, I enjoyed the comedy, and the problem with this movie, though, is that I'm not going to remember any of it. In fact, as much as I hate to say it, I probably will remember more of The Legend of Hercules, a couple years down the line than I do of this film. Even though it is much better on every level. If there's anything about this movie that will stand out, it's when it does something that's kind of bad. Like, you have the army that's established pretty early on. Well, they get in a battle and the king says that half of them were wiped out. Well, was it just me, or did it seem like the army was growing after that? You see, the entirety of them, during this first battle, and yeah, you buy it when he says that they were cut in half, but then it's like every time you see them after that, they're growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and I wasn't entirely sure why, but that kind of made me laugh. There was a few times where I was wondering if they were even acknowledging The Legend of Hercules. It's possible that was all unintentional because, it's just because the way they use the word legend, yeah, I could totally buy it if they said that, it wasn't intentional, that they just wanted to use the word legend in this sentence, and it's just total coincidence. But there's like one part where they're, the storyteller, who's like The Rock's nephew, is giving out various titles as to what they should call Hercules, and even though they don't say The Legend of Hercules, they say a similar name that made me think of that movie. And at the end, there's a line where Ian McShane says, I prefer the man over the legend, and that just made me laugh, and I'm not entirely sure if I was supposed to or not. And that's another character I really liked, Ian McShane's character. He's very funny, but badass in his own way too, and the whole running gag of him trying to accept his death, that made me laugh too. But there are moments where just like you're wowed by how stupid some of these scenes are, and that in a lot of ways also reminded me of The Scorpion King. Now, it's been years since I've seen The Scorpion King, but I remember thinking that it was just kind of an average fantasy flick. I'd say this film is a little bit better, but what stood out the most in The Scorpion King was the absurd moments, the ridiculous moments that just left you rolling your eyes and laughing at the screen, but you're not entirely sure if the filmmaker intended for them to be funny as much as he intended for them to be badass. So like the one scene that stood out the most in in The Scorpion King was when The Rock fires some arrows and they like blast through a door. They hit somebody who gets sent off flying in a direction that was so awkward that you could tell that they were attached to a rope. But even though that was technically kind of bad, it is in a lot of ways that film's redeeming factor. That is all I remember about The Scorpion King. And this film, it has nothing that quite stands out as much as that did, but it does have quite a few moments where and once again, it's intended to be badass, and their tongue might certainly be inserted in their cheek with how over the top and goofy it is, but I wasn't entirely sure if it was supposed to be funny, but I laughed anyway. But the important thing was that I was laughing. I was enjoying myself, even though I'm probably going to immediately forget this movie. So unfortunately, The Legend of Hercules might stay with me much longer, but not for good reasons, whereas at least this film was kind of fun. That's really all I have to say. Would I recommend you see this in theaters? If you do, try not to pay a lot of money for it. This is definitely a matinee at best. Uh, it's also, it's one of those films where if you really wanted to see this movie in theaters, it's not bad enough to change your mind. I thought it was a perfectly acceptable fantasy film, even if nothing about it really stood out, except the occasional goofy moment. But even that, I'm sure I'll forget over time. Whereas if you weren't really all that interested in this film, then I'd probably not bother. It's not good enough to change your mind either. The problem with this movie, though, is, when I see it on DVD, it's probably going to lose a lot of its impact because so much of the visual style relies on you seeing it on the big screen, so you can get all the details. And once it gets cropped down to, television sized, it's just not going to stand out as much. So it's one of those cases where if you're going to see this movie, see it in theaters, but at the same time, if you choose not to, you're not really missing out on too much. I had fun, but like I said, very unexceptional. So that is all I have to say. I did not do a written review, but I did release a written review of Hostel Part 3. So read that. And my next written review shall be of Seven Swords, which is a Sweetheart movie. Another epic, but not as good as this one. So be sure to follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.